Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
After 50 years of oppression, the people of Syria will have a new government. Crowds flooding the streets in major cities across the country, celebrating an end to decades of authoritarian rule as the regime of Bashar al-Assad has collapsed. Rebel forces have taken control of the country, Assad has fled to his exile, and a new era begins. Will it be an era of peace, of stability, and prosperity for the long-suffering Syrian people? Only time will tell. I'm David Smith, and today on The Big Story, we're diving into what happened in Syria. How did we get here? And what will happen next? To help us make sense of an extraordinary series of events in the Middle East, I'm joined again by Professor Elliot Tepper, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Hi, Professor.
Well, thank you. Good morning, David.
Let's start with what happens next in Syria. The Assad regime has fallen. In the near to medium term, what happens now with the government of Syria? Who is running the country right now?
The leader of the country is Ahmed al-Sharaa. He was the head of a coalition which unexpectedly swept the Assad 52-year hold on Syria out of existence in a shocking fashion. We could cover more of the details on that. But who's in charge right now? That leader is in charge. His organization is in charge. He's taking steps to create a transitional government. So now they have been working with the existing former prime minister on a transfer of power to the current leader of their own little mini state, and that's supposed to take place imminently. They're putting together a government, and it's supposed to last until March 31st. It's unclear what will happen after that.
Okay, so just for the listeners' sake, for clarity, in Syria under the Assad regime, there were areas that were not controlled by Assad. This man, Ahmed al-Sharaa, was in charge of a group that controlled one of these other provinces. He formed a coalition of rebel groups, militia groups. They swept through the country very, very quickly and took out the seat of power of the Assad regime in Damascus. The rebels, Professor, were able to take over the country shockingly fast, just 2 weeks after they launched their offensive, and the Assad regime has collapsed entirely. If we contrast that with the Arab Spring in 2011, in that uprising, Assad was able to stand and crush the pro-democracy movement with the backing of Iran and Russia. He went on to wage more than a decade of civil war against his own people. This is really the culmination of that civil war, what we've seen play out in the last 2 weeks. But I'd like some thoughts from you on what changed. Why did Assad fall this time? Why was Iran and Russia not there to back him up like they did in 2011?
As one analyst succinctly put it, the army would not fight to save the regime, and the Iranians and the Russians did not show up. Neither Russia nor Iran at this moment apparently are able or willing to intervene. Russia, as we know, is stretched very, very thin because of their terrific losses they're sustaining in their attempt to illegally conquer their neighboring state of Ukraine. They've pulled out a lot of their material, starting a couple years ago now, basically telling the Assad regime, you're on your own. We need our equipment back home. We need our people back home. And as we know, Iran, which seemed to be invincible, controlling 5 different states surrounding Israel, but Israel has now basically destroyed the Iranian support base. They destroyed Hamas. They've destroyed Hezbollah. They have shown Iran to be extremely vulnerable after Iran attacked Israel. Israel went in and pinpointed took out some of their defensive capabilities. So Iran is not physically able. Iran has suffered a humiliating defeat. Russia has invested heavily in this regime. They have also now registered a humiliating defeat. The Assad regime was on its own and it could not stand.
So do you think what we saw with this rebel offensive that has taken control of Syria, do you think that that was the result of their new leader, the new leader of Syria, Ahmed al-Sharaa, seeing an opportunity where Iran and Russia have been weakened because of the war with Israel, because of the war with Ukraine, and there was an opening there for the kind of swift offensive that we saw? Is this the result of Iran and Russia's defeat and their losses on those two other fronts?
Yes, and quite clearly that was the case. So what's happened here is that during their time in Idlib, they have become a very disciplined fighting force internally inside this one province. They launched this attack the day after Israel and Hezbollah signed a ceasefire, marking basically the removal of Hezbollah as an effective force. So no doubt at all, they saw their opportunity and moved, having been preparing for it quietly for a very long time.
This man leading the country now, Ahmed al-Sharaa, he previously went by a nom de guerre, as you mentioned, Abu Muhammad al-Jalani. He was a jihadist. He was a disciple of al-Qaeda previous to now. About 10 years ago, he publicly broke ties with al-Qaeda and has been styling himself as a more moderate person who can govern an Islamist state, but he has made many statements in the last 24 to 48 hours about Syria being a place for all, Syria being a place where sectarian violence doesn't necessarily need to dominate the way the country functions. So let's talk, Professor, a little bit about nation building and civil society in Syria. If we look back through the past 20, 25 years or so, we have examples like Iraq and like Libya, where regime change led to power vacuum that saw those nations revert back to ethnic and religious tensions. And in the example of Iraq and in Libya, we have essentially perpetual conflict now. Syria is a very complex place. We don't have time to dig into all of it, but there are several religious minorities. One of these minorities, the Alawites, was ruling the country under the Assad regime. The Assad family came from this Alawite minority. So there are lots of religious and ethnic tensions happening in the country right now. What kind of challenges will be faced by this fledgling new regime in Syria as they try to heal the country with a very traumatized population from the last 50 years of oppression?
It's going to be an enormous challenge. The possibility exists indeed that Syria will go the way of those two earlier examples. Once vicious dictators were removed in Iraq and in Libya, the country's basically imploded and they've never really settled down. So the big concern right now, and this is of course known to everybody dealing with Syria, is that Syria will go that same way, that chaos will ensue. States will then, external states will try to get what they can out of this. And internally, the most likely immediate situation is that those groups which have spheres of influence inside, because they've been commanding rebel groups of very different stripes, will want to maintain them. So it's going to be very, very difficult. All the initial moves by this group, to come back to your core of your question, is can this group change its spots? We know it's changed its name, and the initial signs are very promising. They have said, we are calling for an amnesty against the armed forces that fought us, if they were conscripts, not the officer corps. They've also said, as we have shown when we did govern in Idlib, and they brought again their prime minister from that, in fact, the prime minister of that statelet to be the prime minister of the country, we will not impose dress codes. We're not going to tell people how to live. We're not going to tell people what religion to have. All of the initial steps are very promising, but they have, and we have an awful lot of challenges to keep track of going forward.
Yes, and I think that is an important point to highlight in this discussion. President Biden said something to the effect of, this is a great moment of opportunity, but also a moment of risk for Syria and for the Syrian people, because regime change does come with the opportunity for frankly, regression. It's possible to see a regime come in that is worse than the way it was before. We talked about that a lot with the fall of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. But this group, HTS, who are now taking control of Syria, they did govern successfully. They had a formal government of a large province of Syria that they have been ruling successfully for some time now. So, Professor, in your opinion, do you see a possible future of peace and prosperity for the Syrian people coming out of this monumental change?
I'd like to take that answer in two parts. First of all, let's savor this moment. Let's allow the people of Syria to enjoy the overthrow of the brutal dictatorship of the Assad regime. We should rejoice with them that this regime is gone. Now, looking forward is another matter indeed. Will this, as we've seen in other places, have a country fall into some kind of chaos? Or in the case of Iran, when the revolution took place there, will it be taken over by a theocratic regime that is hostile to the West, is bent on the destruction of Israel, and bent on basically expanding influence throughout the region through chaos, through spreading disorder? All of those questions are open at the moment. It's very difficult to make a prediction. We're way premature. All we can say at the moment is that the opening steps by this new regime in Syria are promising, that the statements coming out of the regime also do show, although you can always say, well, they're just trying to consolidate the regime and they'll change their behavior later. No one can answer these questions at the moment, David, but we do know that it is a new chapter for Syria, full of hope and optimism. The terrible, terrible crimes of this Assad regime are going to be exposed. I'd like to turn attention a bit to the interest of Russia and a major Air Force base.
Let's get into that. Let's broaden that out. We have time to really flesh this out. So Russia obviously has had a strong military presence. They backed the Assad regime, but not out of the goodness of their heart or any personal inclination toward Assad. They have significant interests in the region, two very important military bases, one of which is an air base, I believe, and the other is a port. So please, let's dive into that.
The deal that was made was basically Russia came in to save the Assad regime when it was on its heels during the Arab Spring uprising. In exchange, they gained a long-term lease till 2066. The naval base that's there, a lot of the ships there, and there's submarines. It's a major refurbishing hub for the Russian Navy. We have a situation there that I'm watching most closely as an indicator of the future. What's going to happen to those Russian bases? And we all have a concern about our projection of Russia at this point.
Right. And for the listeners, if you can picture a map of the Middle East, Syria has a coastline in the Mediterranean, and that's where this port is. And the reason, I believe, Professor, why that's so strategically important for Russia is because that allows them to access Africa, where they have spent a great deal of time and resources over the past number of years growing their influence in African countries. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. This has been their avenue for transferring basically mercenaries, not Russian troops so much, but mercenaries. We used to call them the Wagner Group. What's left of them have been renamed. They're being used as mercenaries to expand Russian influence quite successfully in Africa. And that port and that Air Force base, those are critical to that expansion. the future of Russia in Africa is also partially now dependent on what happens inside Syria.
So this is a loss for Russia. The fall of the Assad regime is another blow to Vladimir Putin. Would you characterize it that way?
It's a humiliation for him. As you know, the Assad family has gone to Moscow. They've been granted on humanitarian grounds admission. There's a Russian lawmaker who said, let's make them citizens. So then they'll have the protection of Russia as citizens. This is quite literally, David, the least that Russia could do, because the Russians have been so prominent in supporting the Assad regime. And when the Assad regime was in its greatest peril, the Russians simply weren't there. What's fascinating to me is that Russia has allowed the new government to lower the flag of the Assad regime and to hoist the flag, the revolutionary flag of the new regime, in the embassy, the Syrian embassy in Moscow. So Russia has a delicate game to play. They are going to be desperate not to lose their huge investment, billions of dollars of investment, but they are at the moment stretched so thin elsewhere that it's unclear what's going to happen next. Keep an eye on those bases, because the emerging government in Syria also has to decide what to do about Russia's presence inside their country.
Okay, let's look at Iran now, if we can. What has Iran lost here with the fall of the Assad regime?
Iran has lost just about everything here. The army that they created, training Hezbollah, the Lebanese militia, was transformed into a highly effective field army. The link between Tehran and Lebanon has now been severed. Geopolitically, we are seeing a transformation of the region. This collapse of the Assad regime is an important element in that transformation. The inability of Iran right now to use Syria as a transport corridor to reach what they once considered the jewel in the crown of their axis of resistance. Israel has removed that. The collapse of the Assad regime has broken that connection. So it's a terrible geopolitical loss for one of the most malignant and malign forces in the world. The tentacles of the octopus have now been cut off, so to speak. Will they try to move back in some fashion? It would be anathema to the current regime coming to power in Syria. But those are two losing forces that will try to regain some kind of influence, something else to keep an eye on as the situation evolves.
Right, and you had alluded to keeping an eye on what action we may see from Russia, trying to mitigate some of the losses that they have seen because of the regime change in Syria. So, on the whole, what does the fall of the Assad regime, a new regime in Syria, mean for the balance of power in the broader Middle East?
Standing back half a step, we have to say that there's been a geopolitical upheaval in the last few weeks. The unexpected defeat of Hezbollah, which was considered a tremendously powerful force, that the defeat by Israel has changed that geopolitical dimension. Basically, my favorite philosopher, Yogi Berra, I think has summed it up. The future isn't what it used to be. Iran is now on the back foot. Russia is basically on the edge of being excluded once again from the region. The Israelis are seeking sufficient security so that they don't have to worry about being eliminated by the Iranian stated goal of eliminating Israel and using all of its proxies, most of which are now defeated, in order to do so. In America, says that we do not want to play a deciding role in what happens next in Syria, but keep in mind, while Israel has been getting a lot of attention in the fact that they can't allow this chaos at the border to lead to rebel forces hostile to Israel taking over the massive chemical and missile defenses, missile capacity of Syria. So they've been moving in and bombing those and taking them out. Israel and the U.S. and all of the neighboring states have a stake in what happens next inside Syria. a huge change in the balance of power, also in the eternal struggle, David, between a struggle for dominance in the region between Turks, Arabs, and Persians. The geopolitics of the region have been changed. We aren't sure in what direction, and we will have to monitor it closely. But change has happened as a result of the collapse of the Assad regime.
Okay, let's talk about the West's interests here a little bit. For example, there are literally tens of thousands of terrorists in prison in Syria. If they are released, analysts are already warning ISIS could very much resurge in the region. The U.S. government has already acknowledged they are monitoring that as a security threat. So talk to me about what the U.S. is watching. What are the Americans' interests in Syria as regime change unfolds?
Yes, well, let's start with that comment about prisons. The liberation of the prisons is a part of the good news story, in a sense, primarily because the archipelago, the series of torture chambers and slaughterhouses that had been set up by the Assad regime, it's good news to see that those are being, in a sense, liberated. But as part of that, and as part of the general chaos, there's concern that ISIS will move into a vacuum and expand and reemerge as a significant factor. And unlike the current leadership of Syria, which has said, well, we don't want global jihad, we aren't like that anymore, but ISIS is. So the United States, and, we have to remind ourselves, Canada was a major player in all this, in the defeat of ISIS, by working with our Kurdish allies, who are still holding now, I think, 15,000 ISIS prisoners and about 20,000 of their relatives in camps. They are the guardians against the resurgence. The Kurds are the guardians against the resurgence of ISIS. And the United States has a vested interest in working with our Kurdish allies, including Canada's Kurdish allies. So it's a very complex situation. But out of chaos could come the return of global threats in a collapsed Syrian state. That is something the United States and others have a direct interest in preventing.
At the same time, and I think it's important to highlight this dynamic, and maybe we can close on this. The U.S. is so far taking a very passive approach here. In the past 25 years in this region, we've seen a lot of active interventionist policy from Western powers. We've seen regimes toppled, not by the people oppressed by them, but by intervention from Western states. Here we see a U.S. foreign policy focused on allowing the regime in Syria, the new regime, to be shaped by the Syrian people without the direct influence of the United States. What do you think about that? Is that an important change, in your opinion?
I think that this is being overplayed. The broad strokes of this is that neither Republicans nor Democrats want to ever again station troops abroad or be involved in regime change. That's the current broad strokes on this. So no, we don't want to interfere in Syria. But beneath all that are indeed very definite Western and American interests. The fact that the U.S. does not want to use its army, its armed forces, to overthrow regimes is probably very welcome news for America, but also for regimes which are under threat. But we do have to remind ourselves there is a global struggle for power. Russia is a factor inside Syria. What happens next is of direct interest to American interest and to the world, I would argue. But the possibility does exist that there are enduring interests. And we keep in mind, as we always have to do, we're speaking of oil. What the Iranians still can do is threaten the oil interest of the world, and therefore they still have leverage. So it's a very complicated situation, but to say we have no interest there, I think, is grossly misleading. But you cannot ignore the fact that the Middle East is pivotal, and something pivotal has just happened in the Middle East.
Okay, we will have to leave it there for today's conversation. Professor Tepper, as always, thank you so much for spending some time with us here, helping us make sense of as you point out, a monumental change, not only for the Middle East, but for the world and geopolitics across this globe. Thank you for your time today, Professor.
Always a pleasure discussing these incredibly complex matters with you, David.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you. Again, that is Professor Elliot Tepper, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. That's all for the Big Story podcast today. A reminder, you should be listening to the Big Story on the Seeker app. It's a great new listening experience that we have for you. SEEKR, Seeker, available on the App Store or Google Play. Great place to catch podcasts and radio all under one app. Again, that's SEEKR, Seeker. I'm David Smith. Until next time, thank you for listening.